The lights in the studio dimmed, casting a soft glow across the stage as the audience buzzed with excitement. It was the night everyone had been waiting for. Morgan Freeman, the Hollywood icon whose voice had narrated the essence of life itself, was about to appear on live television. The anticipation in the air was palpable, and millions of viewers were tuned in, eager to hear from the legendary actor. At 86 years old, Freeman was still sharp, poised, and respected by people of all generations. His calm demeanor and wisdom had made him a towering figure, not only in Hollywood but in the world. Tonight's interview would be with Vanessa Clark, a host known for her boldness and often controversial approach. She had made a name for herself with her ruthless questioning style, and this interview promised to be no different. The studio audience was on edge, knowing they were about to witness something unforgettable. As Freeman made his way onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause, some even wiping away tears at the sight of the man who had narrated so many significant moments in their lives. With every step, his presence commanded respect. Freeman gave a small, appreciative nod to the audience before taking a seat across from Vanessa. She leaned forward, her sharp eyes glinting with mischief. The conversation was about to begin. "So, Morgan," Vanessa began, her voice smooth yet piercing, "at your age, do you ever wake up wondering if today might be your last?" A shocked gasp rippled through the audience. It was an audacious question, one that hung in the air like a blade ready to strike. But Morgan Freeman did not flinch. He simply folded his hands in his lap, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room deepened, and Vanessa's smirk only widened, as if she had already scored a point. The question had been blunt, intrusive, but Freeman was not rattled. His eyes, deep with experience, met Vanessa's with an unwavering calm. He exhaled slowly, preparing his response. A murmur rippled through the audience, a sense of unease creeping over them. Some shifted in their seats, unsure of how to react. The tension between the host and guest was palpable. But Freeman was unbothered. This was not his first interview, nor his first encounter with disrespect. He had lived through far greater challenges. Vanessa leaned in closer, her gaze never leaving his. But Morgan Freeman had already moved beyond the surface. He wasn't merely answering her question. He was preparing to share something deeper, something far more meaningful than Vanessa could have imagined. "Have you ever sat beside someone as they took their final breath?" Freeman asked, his voice soft yet heavy with the weight of experience. The room fell into a deep silence. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected him to respond this way. Her own words faltered. She had asked a question that was meant to unsettle, but now the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The audience, too, was still. They could feel the shift in the air. It was as if the conversation had taken a sudden, profound turn, moving away from a shallow attempt at sensationalism to something far more introspective. "I have," Freeman continued, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "Many times." The impact of his words was undeniable. For a moment, no one moved. It was as though time itself had paused. "I have held the hands of dear friends as they spoke their last word," he said quietly. "I have watched remarkable men and women take their final breaths. And do you know what they regret the most?" Vanessa, who had started the interview with an air of control, was now left speechless. Her smirk vanished, replaced by a stunned expression. The audience held its breath, waiting for Morgan Freeman to continue. "They regret the things they didn't do," Freeman said, his voice growing softer. "They regret not loving more, not forgiving more, not cherishing life more." The weight of his words hit the audience like a wave. Many felt tears well up in their eyes. Freeman's calm presence and depth of experience had pierced through the superficiality of the moment and reached the heart of something far more profound. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The audience, too, was overwhelmed by the rawness of the conversation. For the first time in the interview, Vanessa was no longer in control. The power had shifted, and Morgan Freeman had quietly taken command of the room. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Vanessa. "You ask me what it feels like to be old?" Freeman asked, his voice unwavering. "It feels like a privilege denied to many." The audience erupted into applause, some standing, others wiping their eyes. Morgan Freeman had not only answered the question, but he had also delivered a message that transcended the interview, touching something deeply human and universal. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The sharp, probing questions had been replaced by something much more meaningful, a reflection on life, love, and the inevitable passage of time. Vanessa, for the first time in her career, was left speechless. The applause slowly died down, but the tension in the room remained thick. Vanessa Clark, once confident and ready to dominate the conversation, now sat frozen in her chair. Her smirk had evaporated, replaced by a confused, almost unnerved expression. She glanced at her cue cards, but the words on the page seemed to blur in her mind. Morgan Freeman had not just answered her question. He had shown her an entirely new perspective, one that she hadn't prepared for. But Vanessa Clark, ever the professional, wasn't about to give up so easily. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain her composure. The spotlight was still on her, and she couldn't let this moment slip away. After all, this interview was meant to be about her, a chance for her to take control of the narrative. She wasn't going to let Morgan Freeman hijack the conversation, no matter how profound his words had been. "Well," she began, her voice slightly shaky but still determined. "That's a beautiful sentiment, Morgan, truly." She managed a weak smile. "But let's be honest, people your age, Hollywood tends to forget about them, doesn't it?" The room shifted. The audience had been on edge before, but now a ripple of discomfort spread throughout the studio. It wasn't the kind of question that invited meaningful dialogue. It was a jab, a challenge. And while the tension in the air had been intense before, it now hung like a storm cloud. Freeman's eyes darkened, but his expression remained composed, as always. He didn't seem angry, nor did he appear to be bothered by the question. He simply leaned back in his chair, his hands folding neatly in his lap as he prepared for his response. The silence stretched on for a moment too long, making Vanessa feel the weight of the question she had just asked. Morgan Freeman's voice finally broke the stillness, calm and unhurried. "My dear, let me tell you a story," he said, his tone slow and deliberate, every word carrying a sense of authority that only a lifetime of experience could impart. The audience leaned in, captivated by his words, as they knew the man had lived through enough to understand life in ways few could. Vanessa, too, found herself listening more intently, despite the awkwardness of the question she had posed. "There was once a young man," Freeman began, "full of dreams, full of life. He believed the world would always have a place for him. He thought that the applause would never fade. But time," he paused, allowing the word to hang in the air. "Time has a way of humbling us." Vanessa's lips tightened, her initial defensiveness faltering as Freeman's words cut through her veneer. She knew she had underestimated him, but this wasn't a battle of wits. This was something far more powerful. "One day," Freeman continued, "that young man grew old, and he realized that the same world that had once celebrated him had moved on. They no longer saw him. They no longer listened." The room fell completely silent. Vanessa shifted in her seat, feeling the heat of Freeman's gaze from across the table. She tried to mask her discomfort, but Freeman's words had clearly struck a chord. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes, and an elderly man nearby looked down at his hands, lost in thought. Freeman's voice softened as he spoke again. "But one night, he sat by his window and watched a storm roll in. And that's when it hit him." Vanessa leaned forward, caught in the rhythm of Freeman's storytelling, almost forgetting herself. "What hit him?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Freeman smiled slightly as though he had anticipated her curiosity. He looked around the room before finishing. He realized that even when the sky turns dark, even when the world seems to have forgotten him, the sun is still there, still burning, still shining, even behind the clouds. For a moment, the room remained still, the weight of his words sinking in. It was as if the audience had collectively held its breath, waiting for the punchline. But Morgan Freeman had no intention of delivering a punchline. His message wasn't about bringing down the house with a clever quip. It was about the quiet, often unspoken truths that came with aging, with wisdom, and with life itself. Vanessa blinked, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. Freeman's storytelling was so simple, yet it carried a depth that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just answering her question anymore. He was speaking to something far greater, something universal that had nothing to do with Hollywood or fame. He looked back at her, his gaze softening, his tone almost paternal. "So, my dear," Freeman said with a kind of quiet authority, "irrelevance is a label the world gives to those who have lived long enough to gain wisdom. But wisdom never fades." The room was silent, but the air had shifted completely. There was no applause this time. The audience was too absorbed in what Freeman had just revealed. His words weren't just a rebuke to Vanessa. They were a reminder to everyone in the room, those watching on television and those in the studio, that life was not measured in the applause you received or the accolades you collected. It was about the quiet moments, the wisdom gained, and the legacy left behind. Vanessa sat there, her lips parted slightly, as if searching for words but finding none. She had been caught off guard, her attempt to stir up drama and controversy now backfiring. For the first time in her career, the tables had turned. She had tried to challenge Morgan Freeman, and instead, he had given her, and everyone watching, a lesson in life, in wisdom, and in the value of experience. The silence in the studio was profound. It was as if the entire room had taken a collective breath, holding it in reverence for the words that Morgan Freeman had just spoken. There was no applause, no chatter, no fidgeting, only stillness, as if everyone in the room, audience, crew, and even Vanessa herself, was forced to reflect on what had just transpired. Vanessa Clark, the sharp-tongued host who had once been so confident, now sat frozen, her face a mix of disbelief and admiration. She had been anticipating a chance to steer the conversation, to maintain control over the interview, but Morgan Freeman had turned the tables in an instant. And what's worse, he had done so with such grace, with such dignity, that it left her with no choice but to listen. For the first time in her career, Vanessa was humbled. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the camera slowly zoomed out, showing the entire set, the audience's stillness, and Vanessa's wide-eyed expression. The audience's attention had shifted entirely. They were no longer focused on the host. They were focused on the man who had just reminded them of something deeply human, the fragility of time and the enduring value of wisdom. Morgan Freeman, however, remained calm. His eyes scanned the room with a quiet, deliberate gaze. His posture was relaxed, his presence both commanding and comforting. He wasn't showing off, he wasn't boasting. He was simply being himself, and in that moment, his authenticity was his greatest strength. Vanessa shook herself out of the spell that Freeman had cast, forcing a smile onto her lips. It was a forced smile, an attempt to regain some semblance of control, though it was clear to everyone in the room that she was struggling. She took a deep breath and cleared her throat. "Well," she began, her voice now shaky, but she was trying to recover. "That was quite the answer, Morgan. But I think we can both agree that you're not exactly the average person. You're a legend. People like you, well, they don't have to worry about the same things the rest of us do." She paused for a moment. "But let's bring it back to something a bit more personal, shall we?" Morgan simply nodded, not taking the bait. He wasn't going to let her manipulate the conversation this time. Vanessa continued, her voice still slightly unsteady but gaining momentum. "You came from humble beginnings, Morgan. Your mother was a cleaner, and your father left when you were a boy. It wasn't an easy childhood. Do you ever resent the struggles you had to endure to get to where you are now?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment the room was tense again. Vanessa was going for something personal, something deep. She wanted to push him into a corner, to catch him off guard, to show her audience that even legends like Morgan Freeman had flaws, weaknesses, or regrets. But there was something in her tone that felt more calculated this time, as if she was trying to reclaim control after the emotional maelstrom Freeman had created. Morgan Freeman remained silent, his gaze unwavering, and the silence stretched on. It was an uncomfortable silence, but one that felt strangely powerful. Finally, Freeman spoke, his voice as steady and measured as it had been throughout the interview. "Yes," he said, his tone deep and reflective. "My father left when I was a boy. And yes, my mother worked as a cleaner. And I would be lying if I said those weren't difficult times." He paused, his eyes locking with Vanessa's. "But resentment? Number, I don't resent it. Because you see, those struggles taught me something that nothing else ever could." Vanessa shifted in her seat. She had been prepared for a different answer. She had expected Morgan Freeman to show some sign of bitterness, some trace of regret, but instead he was offering something much more profound. Freeman continued, his voice soft yet unwavering. I learned how to survive. I learned how to persevere, how to find strength in places I never expected. And that is a gift, not a burden. He paused again, allowing his words to settle over the audience. People often ask me about regret. They want to know if I wish I had done things differently, if I could go back and change anything. But I'll tell you this, if I changed anything, I wouldn't be the person I am today. And I wouldn't have had the chance to be a part of the stories I've told, to be the voice of a generation. The weight of his words hung in the air like a quiet thunderclap. Vanessa was momentarily speechless. She had been hoping for a tearful confession, a moment of vulnerability that would allow her to prove that no one was above the struggles of life. But Morgan Freeman wasn't playing by her rules. He had turned the question back on her, showing that his pain had become his strength. His past had shaped him into the man he was, and he didn't need to apologize for it. As the audience sat in stunned silence, Freeman shifted in his chair, his tone now taking on a slightly lighter edge, but still carrying the same wisdom that had captivated everyone in the room. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, he said, glancing at Vanessa with a subtle smile. I'm telling you this because there's something we all need to understand. Life isn't about what happens to us. It's about how we respond to it. Vanessa opened her mouth, but for the first time in this interview, she had no words. She had tried to push him, to test his character, but all she had done was highlight the depth of his strength. The camera lingered on her for a moment, capturing the realization settling in her expression. This wasn't going as she had planned, and yet there was something undeniable in the way Freeman spoke, something that had disarmed her in a way she hadn't expected. The audience, sensing the shift, began to clap. Slowly at first, as though unsure whether to break the spell of silence that had enveloped the room. But as the applause grew louder, so did the realization that this was more than just an interview. This was a moment of clarity, of raw honesty, and of profound wisdom that only a man like Morgan Freeman could offer. Vanessa, finally aware that she had no more ammunition to use, leaned back in her chair, offering a half-hearted smile. Well, I think we can all agree that you've certainly lived an extraordinary life, Morgan. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today. Morgan Freeman gave her a small nod, his smile warm but knowing. The applause continued, this time with genuine admiration, not just for the man himself, but for the wisdom he had shared so effortlessly. But deep down, everyone in the room knew one thing for certain. No one would ever forget what had just happened here. As the applause reverberated throughout the studio, Morgan Freeman remained seated, his face calm, yet there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. He had answered every question with the precision of a master craftsman, and now as the cheers subsided, the conversation felt complete. But Vanessa Clark wasn't ready to let it go. She had one last attempt to regain control. Okay, she said, her voice shaky but trying to mask it with a laugh. I have to admit, that was unexpected. But let's switch gears again, shall we? She glanced down at her cue cards, desperately searching for something she could use to take back the reins of the interview. Your legacy in Hollywood is undeniable, Morgan. But you've had your fair share of setbacks, right? Your career wasn't always a straight shot to the top. At one point, you weren't getting the roles you deserved. How did you keep going through all of that? Morgan Freeman tilted his head slightly, almost as if he had been expecting this question. He leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees, and gave her a small, knowing smile. It wasn't one of arrogance or superiority. It was a smile born of years of experience, of understanding that no matter how many interviews he'd done or how many people had tried to probe his past, they would never truly understand the depths of his journey. The truth, Vanessa, Freeman said slowly, his voice as steady as ever, is that I never saw setbacks as failures. I saw them as opportunities to learn, to grow, to adapt. Vanessa blinked, momentarily thrown off by the simplicity of the answer. She had been hoping for a juicy story, something that would paint Freeman in a vulnerable light, something that would allow her to cast doubt on his unshakable reputation. But again, Morgan Freeman was making it impossible to play by her rules. He continued, his gaze never leaving hers. The key, as I see it, is that we all face obstacles. Life will always find a way to test us. But how we respond to those tests is what shapes us. And I'm proud to say that I've never let those moments define me. I've let them refine me. The room fell silent again. No applause, no nervous laughter. Just the sound of Freeman's words, deep and clear, filling every corner of the studio. Vanessa, now visibly rattled, leaned back in her chair. The bravado she had come in with was now nowhere to be found. She had hoped to challenge Freeman, to uncover some vulnerability, but instead, she had uncovered the depth of his wisdom and self-awareness. There was no escaping the truth of his words. And that, Morgan added, is the greatest lesson I can offer. You'll face rejection, you'll face pain, but that's not the end. It's just the beginning. Every challenge is an opportunity for growth, if you're willing to see it that way. The audience, who had been hanging on every word, burst into applause again. But this time, it wasn't slow or tentative. This was a standing ovation, a genuine, heartfelt acknowledgement of the life wisdom Morgan Freeman had just shared. Vanessa sat there stunned. She had no response. No words that could match the power of what had just transpired. For the first time in her career, she was speechless, not because she had lost the battle, but because she had witnessed something far greater than her own ambition. Morgan Freeman stood, his height imposing even at his age, and offered a slight bow toward the audience. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I've been blessed to live a long life, and I've learned that the greatest gift is to live it fully, without regret."